Hello and welcome to English class. Albert Gerard regards Heart of Darkness as, quote, among the half-dozen greatest short novels in the English language. T.S. Eliot wanted to make Kurtz's last line in the novella, quote, the horror, the epigraph for the wasteland. Ezra Pound convinced him not to, but he decided to take another line, quote, Mr. Kurtz, he dead, as the epigraph for his poem The Hollow Men instead. Much like The Tempest, many novels, novellas, and poems that fit within the broad canon of post-colonial literatures responds in some way to Heart of Darkness. Season Migration to the North is one mid-century entry, wherein we have Mustafa Said, who goes from Sudan to England, very much a Heart of Darkness in reverse. A more recent entry is Exit West by Moses Hamed, wherein a black character actually walks through a heart of darkness, which is a door, a little bit on the nose there, Hamed. Broad survey courses frequently begin by discussing old dead English guys, Keats, Shelley, Shakespeare, and then moving towards those who stand in subjective opposition to those folks, in deciding how being English is rendered. Thus, Heart of Darkness is really important in figuring out how to create a sense of belonging. So we're going to take a look at the 1899 production that discusses the age of colonialism, the race for Africa, and figures out, well, or at least questions, who the brutes are, who needs to be exterminated, and where the horrors lie. Before we get started, one big caution. Marlowe uses the N-word a lot. So Conrad, used through Marlowe, isn't afraid of it. That's not a word that I'm comfortable with using, so in my comments, of course, I won't, but if I'm quoting Conrad verbatim and it's in there, I'm going to say it. If that makes you feel uncomfortable, let me know. I've been wrong before. A little bit about the author. Joseph Conrad was born into a wealthy Polish family in occupied Ukraine. His parents died young. He found his way into the English Merchant Navy, where he spent some 14 years having a series of misadventures, eventually finding his way to England as a writer. He began making so much money that he stopped sailing and started writing. And he wrote lots of good ones. The Nigger of Narcissus was his 1897 work. Heart of Darkness was 1899. Lord Jim in 1900. Nostromo in 1904. The Secret Agent 1907. Under Western Eyes 1911. He died, I think, in the 1920s. There are a lot of themes that the novel explores, and even though it's short, it's very dense. This is a short video. We don't have time to engage with a chronological analysis of it, so we'll just hit on some major thematic points. We'll start with 4. Race, gender, class, and hegemony. Gender. Women in their proper place. Joyce Carol Oates cautions that when reading the novel, we should remember that it was written for people like Conrad. That is to say, rich, English, white men. Let's think of Marlowe's first important musing on gender as an example. You forget, dear Charlie, that the laborer is worthy of his hire, she said brightly. It's queer how out of touch with truth women are. They live in a world of their own, and there has never been anything like it and never can be. It is too beautiful altogether, and if they were to set it up, it would go to pieces before the first sunset. Some confounded fact we men have been living contentedly with ever since the day of creation would start up and knock the whole thing over. Oates doesn't like this, claiming it's both an ignorant general indictment of women based upon a particular type of woman, the type whose fortunes in life depend upon their professed dependence upon men, a dependence created, ironically, by men, then complained about by men. Let's think here of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, wherein she meets men's arguments that women write poor fiction with the answer that in order to write good fiction, they need agency, the very thing that men deny them. The quotation is also an indictment of empiricism, the way of reducing the world to demonstrable and repeatable facts, which remains all the rage in the Western world. Rightly so, in some cases. Shout out to the health workers currently trying to stop the coronavirus. Still, this valorization of objectivity does a bit of violence to rich and varied human experiences of the world. Not everything is facts, and not every fact is an objective versus a culturally relative fact. And in reducing the sensation of, say, love to the release of serotonin and the satisfaction of primal urges to procreate, we lose a lot of our humanity and what makes our humanity beautiful. In the face of progress in the empirical drive of European men is the opacity of Africans and the African continent. Chinua Achebe doesn't like this part, but it is important to study as a fact. These men seem much more comfortable with uncertainty, with the inability to know, at least in Marlowe's opinion. They come to terms with the incomprehensible that devours the Europeans in the same way the jungle devours the latter's shells and bullets, despite the Europeans' confidence that they were of some effect. John Keats and his negative capability seems firmly in the grips of the African natives class. By removing the action Africa while maintaining societal hierarchies at work in Europe, we see in practice the bizarre sort of classicist intriguing that occurred in Europe, put in stark relief on the African continent, where it seems much less appropriate. Most characters in this Heart of Darkness are there hoping to climb the societal ladder rungs at extreme risk to their health and lives, hoping to get, quote, money. Lots die. And those that survive are somewhat arbitrarily elevated in station based upon their not dying. Marlowe eventually finds the leadership intolerable, including the station manager and the sedentary brickmaker, who are focused on intrigue and cultural performances of power and class in a space which renders such performances totally bizarre. We hear of the manager, for example. He says, quote, when annoyed at mealtimes by the constant quarrels of the white men about precedence, he ordered an immense round table to be made, for which a special house had to be built. This was the station's mess room. Where he sat was the first place, the rest were nowhere. One felt this to be his unalterable conviction, end quote. His unalterable condition. In order to perform class in this space, they need to make a table and make a house for that table in order to make his dictatorial powers on the station clear to everyone. This is not a polite European society. There's one leader and a ton of followers, and that leader is willing to go to extreme lengths to perform his hegemony over others. Race. The big one, and the one that Chinua Achebe flagged the hardest. He quotes in his article An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, this long passage in its entirety. The earth seemed unearthly. We are accustomed to look upon the shackled form of a conquered monster, but there you could look at a thing monstrous and free. It was unearthly, and the men were... No, they were not inhuman. Well, you know, that was the worst of it, this suspicion of their not being inhuman. It would come slowly to one. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces, but what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours, the thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. Ugly, yes, it was ugly enough, but if you were man enough, you would admit to yourself that there was in you just the faintest trace of a response to the terrible frankness of that noise, a dim suspicion of there being a meaning in it which you so remote from the night of first ages, could comprehend. Anthropologist Johannes Fabian cautioned his fellow anthropologists against expressing such sentiments. He challenges the assumption that anthropologists live in the here and now, that their subjects live in the there and then, and that the other exists in a time not contemporary with our own. That is to say, that Europeans and anthropologists live in modernity, and those that aren't European don't. Achebe goes on to argue that Conrad, careful as ever with his words, this is a quotation, is concerned not so much about distant kinship as about someone laying claim on it. The black man lays claim on the white man, he says, which is well nigh intolerable. It is the laying of this claim which frightens and at the same time fascinates Conrad, end quote. Voicedness is another big theme herein, and it's important that Achebe points out that Africans don't really speak in the novel, other than stilted language. Kurtz, on the other hand, has a commanding voice. Indeed, even when his body is wasting away, his voice is what remains. People listen to it. He's apparently a polymath and would succeed at anything. What he succeeds at in Africa is commanding the obedience of the voiceless. And we can think about the voiceless in terms of, say, the pilot on the steamboat. Marlowe talks about how when he's in his death throes, he is expecting the African to say something, but he doesn't. He just fades away. Next, hegemony. Political and cultural. We do love our Antonio Gramsci. The unnamed narrator takes European hegemony very seriously. Within the first couple pages, he discusses the valorized status of the great river, the Thames, saying, England's great men, quote, had all gone out on that stream, bearing the sword and often the torch, messengers of the might within the land, bearers of a spark from the sacred fire. What greatness had not floated on the ebb of that river into the mystery of an unknown earth? The dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, the germs of empires. Marlowe questions this. And this also, said Marlowe suddenly, has been one of the dark places of the earth. He thinks about what it would have been to have been a Roman in the territory of Albion, that is to say, Roman England. This reminds us of Derek Walcott's Ruins of a Great House, which comes much later but deals with the same topic. Marlowe then objects that no European would feel the same way, that is, totally lost, because, quote, what saves us is efficiency, the devotion to efficiency, end quote. Efficiency is a loaded word here. We're to find out that the only real thing this particular continental trading concern is efficient at is extracting ivory by brutalizing native peoples. Like many adherents of ideologies too, one can be skeptical about how faithfully we serve the unselfish ideas that legitimate our hegemony. Marlowe calls the men bound for the interstation and self-enrichment pilgrims, as if they're driven by something higher than brutish profits. There's also a pretty clear sense in Conrad's novella of history, as in big H history, and time, as in big T time, that it belongs to Europe, maybe parts of Asia and the spaces that inherited their cultural traditions, but Africa and many wild spaces and, quote, non-civilized peoples, end quote, have been forgotten by time and history as if those things weren't universal. This is another case of Eurocentrism masquerading as universalism. Indeed, Marlowe's first words in the text, it begins with an unnamed narrator, right, discusses the time when England was savage and wild. If there's any universal, it's that. Reception and integration of the novella has been rich and varied. It's definitely not pro-imperialism, but neither is it anti-racism. It's definitively based on Conrad's experiences, though, no matter what he says. When Conrad himself was anchored in the Congo River near Stanley Falls, remember, as his life as an adventurer, he writes that he put his finger into the mighty river, which he had dreamed about as a child obsessed with blank spaces on maps. Remember that? He continues, quote, a great melancholy descended on me. Yes, this was the very spot. But there was no shadowy friend to stand by my side in the night of the enormous wilderness, no great haunting memory, but only the distasteful knowledge of the vilest scramble for loot that ever disfigured the history of human conscious and geographical exploration. What an end to the idealized realities of a boy's daydreams. This is a useful caution for our level of certainty in our lives. Our certainty about the things that are so fundamentally obvious to us that we don't bother questioning them, as a British person in 1899 wouldn't question the benevolence of empire, or like Kurtz's fiancée wouldn't question the fact that Kurtz's last words were her name instead of what they actually were, quote, the whore. She was certain of it. Indeed, the rightness of European hegemony, after all, the continental concern for which Marlowe works is purportedly a philanthropic enterprise, is called into question by the novel. Indeed, the idea that ivory is the substance being sought after, for which blood is traded, is sort of bizarre. It's not really useful for anything besides ornamentation. In this light, it seems like Caribbean slavery in those colonies are actually cast into a more benevolent light. At least you can eat sugar. Anyway, we'll end with Chabet. He writes in his article, again, the famous 1977 one, that, quote, a Conrad student informed me in Scotland that Africa is merely a setting for the disintegration of the mind of Mr. Kurtz. Which is partly the point. Africa as setting and backdrop which eliminates the African as human factor. Africa as a metaphysical battlefield devoid of all recognizable humanity into which the wandering European enters at his peril. Can nobody see the preposterous and perverse arrogance in thus reducing Africa to the role of props for the breakup of one petty European mind? But that is not even the point. The real question is the dehumanization of Africa and Africans, which this age-long attitude has fostered and continues to foster in the world. And the question is whether a novel which celebrates this dehumanization, which depersonalizes a portion of the human race, can be called a great work of art. My answer is no, it cannot. But Heart of Darkness is still one novella that we read, talk, and think about today. That's all for today. Stay safe, wash your hands.